Hello, everybody. Welcome to Catch a Plant Scientist webinar. Today, I'm going to tell you about the incredible world of seeds with Catch a Plant Scientist. First of all, I would like to do a short self-introduction. My name is Katia Hogard, and I simply love plants. I love plants so much that I have ended up getting a degree in plant biology, and gardening has been my lifelong passion. It's my pleasure to share my combination of enthusiasm and knowledge on botany with this global audience today. I'd first like to tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up between the UK and USA, and I also learned organic gardening with my parents here at our home in the Cotswolds in the UK when I was a kid. Growing up in a place like this, close to nature, and also traveling the world with my parents and learning about plants and animals in other continents inspired my love for the natural world. I would describe myself as a person who is a lifelong learner and has an insatiable curiosity for things that I'm interested in. All of this has led to a strong affinity for plants, and that's what inspired me to become a plant biologist and later on a science communicator. I am currently writing my PhD thesis while building a new career direction as a science communicator. I'd like to tell you a little bit about my science education journey before we dive into the talk. I started my educational journey at Austin Community College, where I then transferred to the University of Texas at Austin. During my time at UT, I did a lot of undergraduate research in the FRI Freshman Research Initiative program on the opening and closing of stomata, plants' breathing holes. From there, I completed a Master's of Research at Imperial College London in Plant and Microbial Sciences, and that was a perfect segue into my PhD project, looking at plants' defenses against aphids with Professor Colin Turnbull, my supervisor. I have also been developing my new career direction as Katia Plant Scientist. So what are my motivations for bringing botany to social media and webinars around the world? First of all, I feel like it's my passion in life to share my knowledge of plant biology with non-scientists. I aim to connect plant science with gardening and use essays, videos, and other visuals to communicate the science. Most importantly of all, I want to inspire curiosity and critical thinking in my audience. And now I'd like to give you a little preview look at my garden to inspire you to see what you can grow from seed in your own garden. That's right, all of these plants are actually grown from seed. Can you believe it? Not only are they all grown from seed, they're all annual plants. That means plants that complete their whole life cycle in 1 year or less. This is a picture from my big greenhouse, affectionately known as Yield Greenhouse here in the UK, where I grow over 15 different types of heirloom and heritage tomatoes, along with peppers, melons, and exotic herbs like Thai basil. The other photos show my vegetable patch where we grow a plethora of different edible plants, including green beans, lettuce, edible flowers like nasturtiums, zucchini, beetroot, radishes, and kale. I'd now like to go on and start our talk by taking a look at what's in store on our learning journey today. Let's have a look at what we're going to cover in today's talk. We're going to begin by talking about the biology of seeds, covering their evolutionary origins as well as their role in plant reproduction. We're next going to look at seed anatomy as well as how seeds find a new home via dispersal and how the dormancy of seeds are broken. We will also talk about the biology of seed germination. Then we're going to move on to a section about in vitro seed germination. This is a technique to optimize your seed germination. Finally, we're going to talk about seeds and you. This section will cover how to choose which seeds to grow, as well as understanding the info on seed packets. We will also talk about F1 versus heirloom seeds and how to store seeds. After that, we will have some closing remarks and an FAQ on frequently asked questions about seeds. Let's talk about why seeds are essential to plant reproduction on land. Seeds are the lifeboat of the plant embryo, which allows a plant embryo to survive outside of a watery environment. The distant ancestors of plants were algae that evolved in Earth's oceans. However, they couldn't colonize the land permanently until they evolved a method for protecting their embryos in a waterproof time capsule, a lifeboat, if you will, that allowed the embryo to stay alive until it found a suitable habitat to germinate. If you think about it, non-seed plants like mosses and liverworts have to grow in very damp conditions. This goes to show that they cannot reproduce and live long-term in areas away from water. Seeds allowed plants to literally take over the world. Let's talk about the origin of seed plants. Did you know that there are many plants that don't have seeds but instead have spores? These are some of the aforementioned plants that have a difficult time colonizing habitats away from very watery and damp environments. Think about where you've seen mosses and liverworts growing. Also, think about where you may have seen ferns and horsetails growing. They are often growing in damp environments, near rivers, and in damp corners of the garden or forest floor. All of this changed around 350 million years ago when the first seed plants, the gymnosperms, evolved seeds. These lifeboats protect the seed embryo and allow them to colonize new habitats. Gymnosperms include familiar plants like conifers, think about it, pine trees, Christmas trees, all of those kind of trees, as well as cycads, and the famous dinosaur tree, the ginkgo. From there, angiosperms evolved towards the end of the Mesozoic time period. When you think of a plant, you tend to think of an angiosperm. Most of the plants that we are familiar with are angiosperms, and these seed plants have been some of the most evolutionarily successful plants in history. Let's talk about the anatomy of the flower. Many types of flowers are what we call bisexual flowers. That means that the flower contains both male and female parts. The male part of a plant is called an anther and filament. So the anther contains pollen and the filament supports the anther. The female part of the plant is composed of a stigma and a style. The stigma is a landing pad for pollen, whereas the style is a corridor that leads from the stigma so that when the pollen lands on the stigma, the gamete, the sperm cell within the pollen grain, hatches out and travels down the style to go to the ovary of the flower. This is where the plant's eggs are, and this is where fertilization happens. Every seed is genetically unique because each seed is created through the fusion of the sperm cell from the pollen and the ovule, which is the plant egg. When these two are united, they undergo the process of fertilization, creating a new and genetically unique seed that will grow into a new and genetically unique plant. In other words, this is plant sexual reproduction. The evolutionary purpose of sexual reproduction is to reshuffle the genetic deck with each new generation. This introduces the raw material of natural selection, genetic variation. This is a real contrast to the asexual forms of reproduction that are very common in the plant kingdom. After all, we have all grown different kinds of plants from cuttings. This is very common with houseplants. The advantage and the disadvantage is that plants created through asexual reproduction are genetically identical copies of the parent plant, and this can leave them more vulnerable to diseases and changing environments. This is one of the reasons why plants continue to do mostly sexual reproduction in the wild. It's a way of introducing genetic variation to keep natural selection going. Let's look at the typical dicot seed. We are looking at a dicot seed because many of the familiar garden plants that we grow from seed are dicots. Monocot seeds have a similar function, and structure to them, but we're going to focus on dicots today. Think of the seed as the plant embryo's lifeboat. Some of the key components of a plant seed are the plant embryo, which we can see up here in the upper right-hand part of the diagram. A plant embryo has all the beginnings of a complete plant. It has an embryonic root called a radicle, the embryonic lower stem, the hypocotyl, as well as the upper part of the stem system, which is known as the epicotyl. Many plants have a plumule, which is the first group of adult leaves, and then they are surrounded by the cotyledons. Cotyledons, or seed leaves, function as the energy source for when the plant embryo germinates and begins to grow, leaving the seed behind. All of this is wrapped up in a protective, waterproof seed coat. So that, in other words, there are three elements to typical seed: the plant embryo, a food supply, and a protective covering. This is what the plant embryo needs in order to survive and get to a place where it can safely germinate. A natural question about seeds is this: are seeds alive or are they dead? After all, a seed does not seem to be growing or consuming food and water in order to stay alive. So what's the deal with a seed? Is it alive or dead? Biologists have a special term for the stage of life that a seed is in. It's called dormancy. This is a stage of suspended animation. The seed is alive, it is metabolizing, but everything is happening very slowly. In other words, the plant embryo is dormant. It is alive, it's undergoing the metabolic processes of life, but it's just very slow. The aim with a seed is to keep the embryo, in this state of suspended animation until the seed can find a suitable place to grow. So, what triggers the plant embryo inside the seed to go from dormant to alive? Let's look at some common triggers to break dormancy in seeds. The most important one would be hydration. Seeds need water in order to break dormancy and begin growing. The tissues within a plant embryo can expand once they are in contact with water. Some seeds also need contact with the soil itself to tell them that this is a safe place to germinate. There are other seeds that need to endure a certain period of cold in order to trigger the release of their dormancy. This is often the natural cold of winter because many plants shed their seeds in autumn with the aim to have these seeds begin to germinate in the spring when conditions are more favorable. Some plants, especially plants that originate in the tropical regions of the world, need heat in order to stimulate their germination, and others actually need to pass through the digestive system of an animal in order to know it's time to start germinating. How do plants avoid competition with their own offspring? This is a serious concern in the natural world where space and limited resources can seriously impact the survival of plants. That's why many plants have evolved techniques to help their seeds get as far away from mom and dad as possible. Seeds may travel using the wind, such as the samaras of maple seeds and dandelion seeds. Some plants, like coconuts, may float across the ocean to land on a new beach where they will germinate and form new coconut palms. Some plants, like the Himalayan balsam, an invasive plant in the UK, have exploding seed pods that launch the seeds far away from the parent plants. Of course, fruit evolved with the purpose to be spread by animals, so animals will eat the fruit or take the fruit with them and drop the seeds inside the fruit, either through discarding the pits or after going through their digestive systems. What happens when a seed's dormancy is broken and it's ready to start germinating? The first part of the plant embryo that emerges is the radicle, the embryonic root. Once the embryonic root is anchored in the growth media, which is usually soil, the hypocotyl begins expanding and then the epicotyl starts to grow. Often, the growth is simply pumping up the seeds with water rather than making a lot of new plant tissue. The plant cells can fill with water and become bigger. After the root is established and after the hypocotyl and epicotyl have grown into an embryonic stem, then the cotyledons unfurl. The cotyledons are the reason why many seed leaves look so generic. After the cotyledons have done their purpose of generating photosynthesis and giving a boost of energy to the new seed plant, then the adult leaves unfurl and the plant can start growing. I'd now like to share one of my very favorite germination techniques, in vitro. This is where you take a petri dish and line it with damp filter paper. Place your seeds on the damp filter paper and seal the petri dish with the top lid and some tape. Then place it in a warm place like an airing cupboard or warm part of your house. The combination of warmth and wet will stimulate most seeds to start sprouting. This is a great technique for any seeds that come from warm climates like peppers, eggplants, and squash. I found that I have over 90% germination rate when I use this petri dish head start technique for my greenhouse plants. I highly recommend it. What to grow from seed? The good news is that almost all kitchen garden vegetable plants, as well as herbs and a lot of flowers, can be grown very successfully from seed. This includes a lot of annual and perennial flowers used in flower beds and for other ornamental purposes, as well as culinary and medicinal herbs. You can even grow cacti and succulents from seed. Now, what are some plants I do not recommend growing from seed? Trees can be a bit hit and miss because of their specialized requirements for germination. Also, houseplants can be a bit dodgy too. Some houseplants are prized for their variegation, and this isn't often inherited when the genetic deck gets reshuffled through sexual reproduction. Therefore, pretty houseplants are better done through asexual reproduction and propagation. Any plant with highly specialized germination conditions is also a bit of a risky prospect for growing from seed, but for everything else, growing from seed is an economical and practical choice. When you get a seed pack, what does all this mean? Let me decode a typical seed pack for you. Up on the top of the pack, on the flap, is usually the expiration date. Seeds should not be used after the expiration date because they may have very low germination. Next, there's often a diagram explaining the life cycle of the seeds, when to plant, when to let it grow, when to harvest, and when the plant completes its life cycle. Many seed plants used in the vegetable garden are annuals. Other information you may see is the depth which you should plant the seed, as well as how far apart seed should be spaced when planting. There may also be notes, instead of a life cycle, about days to maturity, which can help you plan when to plant seeds and when to expect harvests. Other information you may see on seed packs is what kind of light conditions does the plant do best in? Will it tolerate shade or does it need bright sunlight? Others might have advice about what kind of soil, such as whether it needs well-drained soil or whether it will survive in denser soil. There may also even be information about the plant's cultural background and how to use it in different recipes. Other information on seed packs might include watering instructions and the ideal temperature of the plant, as well as its mature size, whether it's a perennial or annual, as well as any other special instructions. If you'd like to order some unusual fruit, veg, and herb seeds, I highly recommend Chiltern Seeds if you're in the UK and Baker Creek Seeds if you are in the USA. The good news is that both of these companies have limited international shipping. Please check out their websites to find out whether either company will ship to your country if you're outside of the UK or USA. One of the most frequently asked questions is F1 versus heirloom seeds. So what are heirloom seeds? It's important to understand the difference if seed saving is key to your hobby or business. Heirloom seeds are varieties of domesticated garden plants that are true breeding. That means that when grown from seed, the new generation will be very much like the parent plants. However, these varieties are seldom used in large-scale commercial farming because their yields tend to be lower and the produce they create may not store as well or have as long shelf lives. Most so-called heirloom seeds predate the 1950s, although these definitions do vary from country to country and which horticulturist you ask. They often have very desirable traits such as deliciousness, beautiful colors, and nutritional value due to their genetic diversity developed by traditional farmers over many generations. What are F1 hybrids? F1 hybrids are first-generation hybrids of two other varieties. F1 means filial generation 1. And the bottom line is that these are very unsuitable for seed saving. They may have desirable traits in this F1 generation, but they are not true breeding. If you save the seeds from your F1 varieties, the offspring will be very different from the parent plants. This technique of hybridizing two varieties to get the best of both has been more common around the world since the 1970s. To their credit, F1 hybrids tend to be more consistent than heirloom varieties because of their genetic uniformity. But this does come at the cost of not being able to save the seeds from your produce for use in the next year. Also, some gardeners have commented that F1 hybrids tend to be more expensive than heirloom varieties. Some people also find it objectionable that the seed companies often keep a secret what are the two other varieties used in the production of the F1 varieties. Some people prefer to have more control over the production of their own seed. Let's take a look at the genetics behind why F1 generations are not the same as the F2 generation. That's the filial 2 generation. An F1 hybrid is produced by taking two different varieties of a vegetable or whichever plant we're dealing with. In this case, we're going to use this fictional tomato as an example. We want the best of both varieties. Let's say that we have a very small tomato that has an incredible flavor, and we have a big tomato that's big, but its flavor is pretty lackluster. What happens when we hybridize tomato A and tomato B is that we get a new generation of plants that contain the genes for the delicious flavor and the genes for the huge size. So we get a generation of consistent A-B tomatoes. What happens when we allow the A-B tomatoes to reproduce sexually and create the F2 generation? Well, what happens is that we get a generation of plants with an unpredictable mix of traits. Some are the best of both and some are the worst of both. So when we breed together our two big, delicious tomatoes, we expect to get more big, delicious tomatoes. But in actuality, what we get is we get some tiny, delicious tomatoes, AA, some big, delicious tomatoes, AB, some tiny and distasteful tomatoes, BA, and some tomatoes that are big and bland. How do you source and store the best seeds possible? In general, the safest choice is to go with professionally grown, in-date seeds for the best results with germination and plant development. If you have seeds, it's a good idea to store them in a cool, dry, dark place with consistent temperatures. Therefore, it's a much better idea to store your seeds for your garden indoors in a cabinet in your living room rather than keeping them in a shed. In a garden shed, it can be damp, it can be too hot and too cold, and this can end up killing the seeds before they get a chance to germinate. The stable temperatures indoor in your home year-round are much more suitable for increasing their longevity. In general, most seeds are viable for around 2 to 4 years after purchase. A good rule of thumb is that a bigger seed has a longer storage life and that a smaller seed has a shorter storage life. We've been on a thrilling journey of discovery in today's lecture. Thank you so much for joining me. We've learned so much about the biology of seeds and learned practical tips that you can use in your own gardens and farms. Let's just cover the highlights of our talk before we close the session out. First of all, let's remember that seeds are the plant embryo's lifeboat. Every seed is genetically unique. It's an individual. It's not like plants that are grown by cuttings or other forms of asexual reproduction. In order for a seed to begin its journey into a plant, dormancy must be broken, and dormancy can be broken through various means. Mostly it's stimulus from the environment, and that is what you, the gardener, can control. It's great to know that most garden plants for both hobby and commercial use can be grown from seed. It's also important to understand whether you have the right environment to grow the type of plant you wish to grow from seed. So, as they say just with medicine, always read the label. We've also learned about the perils and the advantages of F1 hybrids. We found that heirloom seeds are true breeding and a better bet if saving seed is important to you and your business or hobby. Finally, we've learned the basics of how to store seeds properly. Thank you so much for joining me at this webinar today. I would like to invite all of you to keep in touch by following me on my science communication social media presence online. Every week, I add new content to all of my accounts, so please make sure to check in every week for inspiring new essays, photography, videos, and infographics. I highly recommend checking out my content on Instagram, Twitter, aka X, TikTok, Facebook, and YouTube. I really look forward to seeing all of you there, and please let me know if there are any plant biology, agriculture, or general botany topics that you would like to see me cover in my social media. Since this is a recorded event, I cannot do a live Q&A, so instead I'm going to answer some frequently asked questions from fans on my social media. Kieran on Twitter asked about collecting wildflower seeds. He wanted to know why the wildflowers that he planted one year in his garden did not come back the next year. Here's my advice for Kieran and other people who want to start their own wildflower meadows. Wildflowers can be either annual or perennial. So, if you want wildflowers that will come back year after year, I suggest researching which of the wildflowers, indigenous and endemic to your part of the world, are perennials rather than annuals. Indigenous means it's naturally found in your local area. It's not a garden plant that was imported from a faraway land, and endemic means that that species is found nowhere else in the world. You may live in a place where there are endemic wildflowers found nowhere else, so it would be terrible to crowd them out with imported exotic plants. You can save some money by collecting your own wildflower seeds from local wildflower meadows. If the wildflower meadows are on private property, it's very important to get the permission of the landowner. Also, if you know that there are any endangered or rare wildflowers in your local area, do not collect those because those may have legal protection. But overall, if the wildflowers are thriving in your local environment, that is a good place to start with collecting wildflower seeds to plant in your own property. What I like to do is I like to take seed trays, fill them with potting soil, and put my wildflower seeds into the trays. I then let these germinate and get established as small plants before cutting out pieces of turf in my field and planting this wildflower tray so that the wildflowers do not have to compete with the local grasses. Sikander asks, how do you perform a seed viability test? Great question. Seed viability is a measure of how many seeds will germinate from a pack of seeds. Basically, do the same in vitro germination technique that I mentioned earlier in my talk. This is also a handy way to test the average number of seeds that germinate from your seed pack, especially if it's an older pack of seeds or one that has doubtful origins. Simply put your seeds on a damp piece of filter paper or paper towel and place them in the petri dish. This petri dish can then be put in a warm, dark place, and then you can count how many seeds sprout. If you want to use the seeds, you can then use tweezers to transfer them to soil. If you don't want to use the seeds, you can simply discard them. It's also worth noting that some seeds do need specialized germination conditions, and they may be viable, but maybe those germination conditions are just very hard to replicate at home. So always use common sense. I have one last question sent by Morgan in the United States of America. She recently saved an heirloom watermelon seed from a fruit that she ate at a family gathering, and she would like to know how she can grow this watermelon seed into an adult plant. Well, any seeds that you have collected through any methods, it's not buying them from a seed company where they come viability tested with growth instructions, is always going to be a little bit risky, but it can also be very rewarding and exciting. So I would say go for it. Whatever type of seed you collect, it's important to identify the plant species correctly and then research online or using books how to germinate and provide optimal conditions for that type of seed. Watermelon seeds, according to what I have read, undergo the same treatment for germination as heirloom winter squash do. And I'm pretty wild about squash, so these are tried and true techniques. When you collect your seed, it is important to let the seed dry out completely and store it for a period of several months up to a couple of years before trying to germinate it. Before you germinate your seed, it is important to let the seed soak for 24 hours in lukewarm water. You can also use a piece of sandpaper to gently scarify the outer husk of the seed to help water get into the seed and help the plant to start germinating. After the watermelon seed has soaked in the water for around 24 hours, make sure that the seed has sunk to the bottom. Unviable seeds will usually float. This shows that the interior of the seed, the cotyledons and the embryo have dried out and probably can't be revived. However, if they've soaked up water and taken in that water, imbibed it, they will become heavier and more dense and sink to the bottom of the container you're soaking them in. After that, the watermelon seed can be planted directly into the soil, and it should be balanced on its side with the flat parts, with the thin part of the seed facing upwards, because this helps decrease the chances of the seed rotting while it's in the soil. You can also simply place the watermelon seeds in the petri dish and use the petri dish germination method, the in vitro germination, to give them a boost, especially if you live in a climate with cooler temperatures. If you're in a hot climate, putting them directly into pots or soil should be just fine. Morgan, I wish you all the best in your watermelon growing endeavors. Let me know how you get on with that. Many thanks to all of our gardeners and horticulturists as well as plant lovers who sent me these thoughtful, probing, and insightful questions. I hope this inspires you to stay curious about plants. I would like to give a big thank you to my wonderful host, John Milton, and his team at AgroGrad. I really thank you so much for giving me this global platform to talk to a new audience all around the world and to share my passion for plant biology as well as my practical knowledge of how to grow plants from seeds. I really appreciate being able to talk to an even bigger audience than usual, and thank you so much for accommodating me with some of the technical challenges we faced while planning and presenting this webinar. Finally, I'd like to thank you, the listeners, the audience members out there all around the world for tuning in today and listening to my webinar. I would like to encourage everybody to stay curious about plants. Plants will never cease to amaze and delight us with their incredible adaptations, as well as how they work at the cellular and molecular level. Plants are the basis of our food chain, and we should always be grateful for that and think about that whenever we work with plants as a business or as a hobby. I wish all of you the very best in your future agricultural and gardening endeavors. Stay curious about plants, everybody, and hope to see you on social media. All the best from Katia Plant Scientist.